Hi, I'm Kelly Clifton, Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Portland State University. Welcome to another edition of the Friday Transportation Seminar. Today we have Andrew Mortensen from David Evans & Associates, and he's going to talk to us about some of the federal highways traffic forecasts, and specifically, I think, talking about Oregon and what it means for us here. So, thank you.
Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Good morning. Thanks to John Mackler. Talking to him a month ago, he said either jazz up the title or I'm not coming. So anyone else who came just because of that title, you know, please feel like you've had some input. But that's the end of the comedy's over now, okay? So I want to give you, this is the only intensive text-written slide of the presentation. I just want to give you an overview of what I have for presentation. I'm hoping to get it all done in about 43, 45 minutes, and then have a good 15-minute question and answer period. I want to give a brief overview of FHWA's tracking of vehicle miles travel statistics, nationwide statistics, how they revise those forecasts and come up with new trends and how they might apply to local planning, but then spread out some Oregon statewide VMT experience, narrow that into the Portland metro area as metro and other jurisdictions have combined and have been looking at VMT statistics within the Portland metro area. But before that, you know, perhaps give some national exposure about what other states are experiencing significant growth or decline in travel and perhaps why. And then get down to the specifics, and that was the reason why I even got into digging up some of this data, was looking over the shoulders of some of the plans that we've done way back in the middle of the last decade to see, you know, are those plans resilient? Are they based on resilient forecasts? And if not, you know, what do we need to do and go back in and refresh, update, and perhaps replace some of those earlier planning premises? And I used McMinnville's transportation system plan as an example. That was predicated on external travel in the 99W corridor, so we'll start looking at ATR data in the 99W corridor on the periphery of the Portland metro area. We can even look at some valley-wide, Willamette Valley-wide, for some shoulders to look at experience, and then bring that into a summary of, well, what do you do in local transportation planning when you're faced with needing to rely upon ATR-based data to establish forecasts and predicate your plans on. And so that's the overview of the discussion today. And I'm going to warn you that it's laden with a lot of graphic. And copies of the presentation will be available to you. Typically, on the y-axis, you're either going to see average daily traffic, VMT, or some VMT per capita measure. Sometimes that'll spill over into the secondary vertical axis, and then a time sequence across the horizon. So that's the kind of the formation of today's topic. Couple of things. Prior to the beginning of the last decade, there's been a rather aggressive and consistent incline and growth in vehicle miles of travel through the U.S., and that's primarily focused on light vehicle. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and I'll talk to that in a little bit. But just at the turn of the decade, the VMT per capita ratio started to plateau significantly, and then it dropped dramatically for a short period of time during the 07, 08, 09 recession. And it has continued to stagnate. And that's the whole question of, well, what does that mean nationally? What does that mean within Oregon? What does that mean within even our local communities at the corridor level, let alone citywide level? And it's the basis of the entire conversation today. If you looked at VMT trend, even including the last 10 years, there's a pretty strong regression equation dating back well into the 1970s. But that latter decade here is the one that we're focusing on. And why are we so plateaued after the recession? And what's likely going to be the trend henceforth? What are we going to be looking at when we apply growth trends into the future? I'm going to try to stick to one. From 2003 up through 2007, right before the recession, that trend was still significantly increasing. Since 2000 and 2007, at the recession, we've had some ups and downs, some resurgence in economic growth that might be generating some of the additional travel demand, but it's been peak and valley for a number of years now. And that relationship is actually either fully plateaued or in decline, depending on where you're looking across the country. So the Federal Highway Administration was reluctant to make any changes to their national policy, thinking there might be a resurgence of that pre-recession trend. Maybe this was just a one-time only occurrence, but given that it's not resumed that significant growth, they've been doing alternatives analyses, and they've finally come back to the notion that the trend flattened before the recession. The recession had a dramatic impact, but we're probably in a new era, and henceforth they've revised their policy to focus more specifically on the way forward. And there were a number of skeptics that were causing them to challenge those old assumptions about traffic growth throughout the country. There were some who were arguing for a back-to-the-future trend once the recession is over. There are others who are saying there's probably an enduring shift here, and yet there are others who are saying there's probably some case in point or argument that we might see an ongoing decline in the VMT per capita. Other critics were saying, oh, the VMT adjustments and travel behavior was more directly tied to gas prices over this time period, and in most technical research that's been found to be a contributing factor, but not the single point of comparative to indicate reasons for that shift in VMT per capita prior to the recession, and then a continued decline since then. What FHWA's revised findings include are, look, we all can agree that there are life cycle events that affect travel behavior, aging population. I've highlighted declining per capita income because I'll bring that notion back in another slide. But then periodic movements, economic downturns, as we've seen within the last 10 years. State, local growth management policies were acknowledged as a contributing factor to how localized travel behavior might be affected. And then there are certainly the social trends, as we now have a fully balanced gender workforce status. That wasn't so in the 70s and the early 80s, and it was a contributing factor why we saw significant VMT growth in VMT per capita as more women joined the workforce and were included in the scoring for commute travel and other trip purposes. And then, you know, your generation, the majority of you here, the millennials, are having a significant impact on travel behavior because you're making remarkably different choices about where you live, how you travel, and what you do throughout the day. A lot different than my generation of 20 and 30 years ago when we were just joining the workforce. I did another comparison of U.S. VMT per capita, and the red line here is the median income inflated to 2013 value. And I didn't cook the axes, but I tried to get it to the point where median income was roughly at the VMT per capita point right at the recession. And I think you'll see here on a couple of the vertical bars within the middle of this graphic, when that 07-08 recession hit and the sharp fall-off in VMT per capita, that coincided with a pretty significant reduction in the median income for U.S. families or households. And that has continued to decline and is now in the beginnings of an uptick on a national average. I have one more bit of comedy. My 401k simultaneously took a major hit. I'm still a little bitter about that, but I put that in there because people started making different decisions about where they lived and how they commuted. I live outside the urban growth boundary, and I was on a school board trying to figure out how to get a bond measure passed. in '07. And when the crash hit, we saw major subdivision, new homeowners evacuate Exurbia and come back to the metro area because they couldn't afford to live out there any longer. They couldn't afford to spend that much time on the road back and forth to work within the Portland metro area. And those kinds of singular, individual and household impacts, caused people to rethink about, how they were getting to work, where they chose to live and work. And I put that in there a little bit as a joke, but it really did, the recession really had a significant impact on people's behavior. Now, on the national trend, the lower and middle income categories for the typical household have not grown in their income status as the upper income. And that is, in many research pieces, it's a telling indicator of more of that individual decision making, because the costlier it is to commute when you're trying to balance all things else being equal, makes it more difficult to choose longer distant, more expensive commuter behavior. And you'll have that slide for reference if you need to go back following the presentation. So FHWA then put together a set of revisions by vehicle class for both a near-term 20-year planning horizon and a 30-year planning horizon. In the near term, the average annual growth rates were slightly larger than in the 30-year average. Light-duty vehicles, slightly less than 1% a year across the average, including all truck classes, is a little over 1% average annual growth rate. But that drops to about 0.75 over a 30-year planning horizon. And that was their baseline from the federal estimate through FHWA. They also put some shoulders to that, a more pessimistic forecast as well as an optimistic forecast. So for all vehicles in the 20-year planning horizon, baseline at a little over 1%. Pessimistic forecast is more about 0.94%, and then the optimistic forecast is a little over 1.14% as an average annual growth rate up to and including year 2032. Again, those are dramatically lower for a 30-year planning horizon. So to all intents and purposes, beyond a 20-year planning horizon, the growth rates, the trend is to continue to drop beyond the 20-year planning horizon. So what does that look like in comparison to the actual data that's shown here on this chart since 1971? Again, here at the recession, but following the actual data up through 2013 or 2014, the optimistic trend kind of resumes what you would expect to see as a regression over the last 30-plus years. And then the baseline is something less than that, and the pessimistic forecast is again slightly less than the baseline and optimistic. National VMT trends. Looking at McMinnville, I wanted to see, how is Oregon stacking up amongst other western states, given that Oregon has had a 20-plus year experience in statewide growth management policy, as has Washington and to some degree California, and just do some comparison of western states, but then started getting curious about other states throughout the West, and that drew me to Texas, and then eventually Florida, who has also a statewide growth management policy. And when I looked at Florida, I saw a pretty large hump out there that I really couldn't explain compared to the rest of the western states. And so I threw in Georgia, which really made me stop and think, what is going on in the Dukes of Hazzard? What are they doing in Georgia that they're not doing anywhere else in the West? But Oregon, Washington, and California all had a similar drop in VMT per capita, a plateauing before the recession, a drop since, and then a continued plateau since the recession. And the average VMT per capita is much lower in the West as it is in other Midwestern and Eastern states. Now, a lot of our states out here, we have significant rural areas, much larger geography, so there's got to be a number of factors in play there. Bearing that in mind, we've got a few others. slides to show. And just real quick, if you look at the country state by state, the West has a fairly low VMT per capita, and this study was completed in 2011, so it's not as current as today. The Southeast has significantly higher VMT per capita, as does some states in the Midwest. Wyoming and North Dakota are natural resource extraction states, and there's got to be something going on there about that. But I thought this was a more telling slide. What's been the percent change in VMT per capita since 2005, which is at about the most pronounced point when we've actually experienced the plateauing of that VMT per capita growth in the country. Oregon and other western states have had a more significant drop in VMT per capita since then. John? That was not clear in the study. And so I just immediately thought, you know, as they're doing oil extraction in North Dakota, there was a massive in-migration, and there was no land use policy really driving any of that, no smart growth or anything controlling that. It was get everybody there, get them to work, and it didn't matter how far they drove, and price was not the issue. So it's not the same kind of land use transportation relationship issues that we're accustomed to in a more stabilized local economy. Make sense? Yeah, I don't. That might be. That might very well be. We might be seeing their driving statistics, but they could be temporary and not resident. That's a really good point. So national VMT variation. I will say at the end, if you want to give me your email, I'll email you the citational sources on a number of these studies so that you have access to them if you'd like that. So some of that national research said, look, the declining VMT per capita doesn't necessarily correspond to how badly the states suffered through the economic downturn. So the recession in and of itself wasn't, you know, the key characteristic. More importantly are other things like, you know, the shifting in the age and makeup of population. Millennials, 19-year-olds back in 1983, about my age, 87% of us had driver's license. Now, only 69% or less. So that's a significant tell. Increased urban density rather than just increased urbanization. And urban density, along with other urban factors like quality of transit, the walk environment, all of those things have a more dramatic effect. And I'll talk briefly a little bit about that later on. And then finally, no strong trend linking economic growth or stagnation in VMT per capita trend. Per capita VMT decline began prior to the recession. I think that's a key thing to recall. And the driving per person stagnated well in the mid-2000s while the gross domestic product continued to decline. So let's look at Oregon State and some of the neighboring states. Washington State's decline and plateau in VMT per capita even preceded this last immediate decade. Yes, VMT continues to grow statewide, but the VMT per capita declined and plateaued well before other states. And as a result, WashDOT has revised their statewide VMT forecasting policy. They're no longer looking at those long-term historic trends because in use of those, they're consistently overestimating VMT statewide into the future. They're looking more at near-term trends, statewide traffic, looking at the national trends, and current VMT research showing the flattening of the VMT. So prior to their adjustment, you know, they were looking at a continued growth trend in VMT raw, not VMT per capita, and now just in the raw VMT forecast, they're showing a decline, a plateauing and a decline over the next decade or two. Colorado State has had a similar statewide adjustment in their VMT forecasting. They too have seen a continued incline in VMT, some plateauing in the last 6 years. but the VMT per capita began a little bit higher than Oregon and Washington, and has continued to drop and plateau since the recession. Their forecasts are by 2040 they'll have a continued incline in VMT, but a straight plateau in VMT per capita over the next 30 plus years, or 20 plus years. Oregon, similar to Washington, began plateauing at various points, but certainly by 2000 a significant plateau and then a decline since the recession. And it has even seen a decline in VMT, net VMT statewide. So there's some comparables there amongst the states. So I brought the median income history back from the national trend to the Oregon condition. On the Y graph here for the yellow line, it's the billions of annual VMT on Oregon highways, and the blue line is the median income inflated to year 2013. Again, trying to get that graph to kind of match up with the VMT at about the time our VMT per capita began plateauing in 2000. You can see that in both the 2001 recession and the 07-08 recession, you know, there was a dramatic effect either plateauing or dropping in VMT per capita. But similarly here, we had a reduction in the average or median income during that period, and it continued to drop until just recently over the last couple of years. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, whether that trend continues to uptick in Oregon as a reflection of a resurgent economy, and that we get a regained foothold in the average earning capacity of individuals and homeowners across the state. Oregon State Highway VMT, the DOT has had a historic trend similar on just state highways. So this is billion annual VMT on just state highways across the state. Back in 2005, the statewide Oregon Transportation Plan forecast looked at the past 20 years and kind of projected that same trend out over the next 20 to 30 years, and that's reflected here in the red line. The actual VMT experience on state highways following the recession and in our current plateau means we're significantly short of that pre-recession and pre-plateauing forecast. And if we took FHWA's roughly 1% a year growth as a compounded growth rate to year 2030, we're going to be at about a 25% lower estimate into the future than what we were estimating prior to the recession back in 2005. That can mean a lot statewide. I think those kinds of differences mean quite a bit more when you're at the citywide or project level. One of the big things in Oregon that has been occurring for several decades now is the shift from a rural to an urban statehood. In 1980, you know, we were roughly 60% rural, and now we're almost 60% urban. And a lot of that urban growth and shift has been in the Portland metro area. So that's a key thing to remember. And similar things were happening in other western states that may be a little different than the majority of the southeastern states. So on a county-by-county basis, I'm going to kind of rapidly go through these. This is the average annual growth rate in VMT on state highways by county across the state. Prior to the recession, in the period from 1980 to 2007, Deschutes County, Bend, Redmond, kind of the jump-off, you know, recreational center of the state, very popular destination. It had the highest annual growth rate during that period. And the Willamette Valley and the Portland metro area similarly had high levels of growth. But the southwest Oregon coast and some of the landlocked rural counties had declining growth rate in VMT on state highways. That might be directly reflecting the shift from rural to urban population. Prior to the recession, the immediate slowdown, again, Deschutes County was still experiencing growth in average annual increases of VMT on state highways, but the majority of eastern Oregon and the rural counties were in decline. Then, during the two-year recession period, Coos County was the hardest hit county. there was evacuation in population and loss of jobs. Deschutes County was then beginning in decline. There was decline both in the western coastal counties and Clatsop. I'm still not sure why. Hood River still had some growth, but even the urban area in Willamette Valley states saw a decline in VMT on state highways within those counties. Excuse me. Then since the recession, we've seen resurgence in the valley counties, not so much yet on the urban, Multnomah County, Malheur County, and Umatilla-Baker, Union County in the Far East. There's a reason why there's resurgence there is because I-84 is a dominant indicator of VMT on the state facilities within those counties. It's really not tied to population. It's really tied to interstate commerce. And so it's an indicator that interstate commerce appears to be resurging through those in terms of VMT on state highways. It's not necessarily an indicator that the economies in those, the local economies are driving that. So from 80 to 2013, you know, here are the county-by-county averages. Again, the southwest and the inner southern and eastern rural counties over this long period of time have had a decline in VMT on state highways rather than any growth. So Portland metro area, real quick, the Portland three-county urban area, talking with Dick Walker at Metro, as they've been tracking this data for some time, they started seeing plateaus, at least declining rates of VMT per capita growth well back into the 90s, but certainly by 2000, a continued and significant decline in VMT per capita. Now, I'm having a hard time just at the moment explaining 03, and I don't have that in my hip pocket, but that spiked back up and then has been in serious decline since then. And we'll get back to some reasons why shortly, but I just wanted to bring up our immediate urban area experience on VMT per capita here. ATR data use in local transportation plans. I'm going to really quickly go through why is this important. If we're outside of MPO areas, or even if we're in an MPO area, and we're looking at our automatic traffic recording data and trying to figure out what's important and why should we pay attention to these trends. If I'm in a single city with a highway running through it and I've got some ATR data on either side, we're typically using those as the basis from which we'll make a projection 20 years forward in a local transportation plan. So we'll look typically at the last 20 years, flip that forward and say if those trends previously continue into the future, we would expect travel on that state highway or major arterial to continue, and hence make decisions about what kinds of solutions from a vehicular standpoint. Not going to fold in the need to look at multimodal stuff in this conversation. I'm not saying that that's not important, but just if we're looking at vehicular travel demand. Within an urban area that may have a travel demand model, ATR data is usually used to try to pin down the traffic that's coming in and out of a region that we aren't documenting through survey data of local residents to find out their travel behavior. And we're using that data to similarly develop and update our travel demand models to indicate what the level of travel demand is occurring at our Cordon stations. And so those are key pieces in a travel demand model that ATR data are really important. So if we're looking at good ATR data and looking at those trends and incorporating that in our estimates, then we feel pretty confident on some of the key facilities that, you know, are a focus of the ports of entry in individual cities. As input into our calculating future travel demand, we draw upon that and establish our 20-year capital improvement plans, and as a result of that, we go looking for money to fund those. So using McMinnville, Oregon as an example, the nearest long-term ATR station of significant importance is either well south of Newburgh on 99W, which is off the map here, on Highway 18 in rural Yamhill and Polk County, or in the urban area, the other side of Newburgh, between the Portland Metro and Newburgh area. And that's the key ATR station that we use to establish calibration points for our external travel into and through McMinnville. In 2006, we looked, using standard practice, we looked at the 20-year trend for 99W and saw that it would equate to about anywhere between a 40 and 50% growth rate over a 20-year planning horizon. We applied that within our travel demand model, matched that with the trip generation characteristics of McMinnville residents, and calibrated our model and drove the planning process to identify street capacity needs from that in 06. We were a year away from seeing the crash, and immediately upon adoption, the questions started coming back, well, what does that mean? And we weren't seeing, a 2 or 3 or 4 year trend in plateau. But this is just a set of graphs that kind of indicate, where does the data fit within the overall planning process. So more specifically, then we said, well, let's go back in and look at what was going on 99W, and is there a significant impact that we need to be aware of? These were all of the trend lines that we were testing using that Highway 99W data, which is just to the immediate east of the Newburgh, what was then their city limits, but it's between Newburgh and Sherwood, if you're familiar with the 99W corridor that joins 18 out to the west. Tualatin's here, and I-5 is here. We looked at that trend and said, well, what's happened since 2006? Well, we're nowhere near where we were projecting to be just within the last 8 years. And that gave us some cause to say, well, is that just the recession, or what's going on there? So as just kind of an example about how you might want to look at the broader geography, we said, well, let's look at all of the Cordon stations around the Portland metro area, excluding Clark County, and see if similar patterns were happening on the Cordon periphery and state highway entry and exit points on the west and southeast. And that included another ATR station, Rainier, up along the US 30 corridor, US 26. Here's the Newburgh station on 99W. Look at I-5, but include 26 out on the Sandy corridor, and then I-84 at the Sandy River. It's hard to see here, but I-5 has had a pretty significant increase in VMT, and that dropped and plateaued since the recession. This chart here is the non-I-5 set of ATR data. And the yellow line is the Newburgh-Dundee, or the Newburgh corridor. The blue line here is US 26 out by Sandy. It had a significant drop, and I can't explain that just yet. But all the other stations have been at a relatively low growth or a decline in plateau, similar to Highway 99W. So just as a quick subset, these charts are a combination of looking at both city population growth within the urban growth boundary, including Wilsonville, Tualatin, and Sherwood, and then looking at population growth in Newburgh and in McMinnville. And this chart to the bottom left here is what is the annual average population increase per city prior to the recession, and what is the share in total comparing all of those. And it's roughly proportionate amongst all of those cities. And here is the chart of those cities. So McMinnville is the blue line to the north. The purple line is Tualatin, which has had some significant population growth since the 70s, particularly in the 90s, but it's roughly balanced and plateaued in the last decade. The red line is Newburgh, and then the cyan line is Wilsonville, and Sherwood is the green line. So you've seen Sherwood pick up in population. But I note here that both McMinnville and Newburgh had a significant drop in annual population increase, right up to and including the recession. And then if you look at the time period since the recession, 2009 to 2014, the proportion of population growth within the UGB is much more significant than the exurban cities outside the UGB. And I thought that was something that needs to garner a bit more attention. That's probably some ramification of what we talked about earlier, the value of time and travel. but also, some implication for the quality of available housing and affordable housing with transit and other travel options, and a closer proximity to job place. So this will be interesting to continue to track here. I'm going to quickly go through a set of slides here so that we can get to question and answer in 10 minutes. So taking 99W as part of a comparison to other ATR data in the valley, including Highway 18 well to the west and the Center and Marion Street bridges in Salem. So here we have a standalone exurban city kind of between the urban areas, well into the rural area along to the Coast Range, and then within the Salem-Kaiser urban area itself. A number of charts now, and I'm going to just explain how these are set up. Each set of charts will give you a time frame, and in this set of charts, this time frame is 1977 to 2013. So the entire population of our data at some of these key state ATR sites. Highway 18 out in the rural area is in the lower left, 99W Newburgh is in the upper right, and the Center Marion Street bridges in Salem are in the lower right. And what I'll do is show the trend line for that time period and eventually compare that to the FHWA trend forecast as a way to compare the way forward. Well, why did we see, a significant climb in Highway 18 traffic? It was the opening of the Spirit Mountain Casino. It had a tremendous impact in trip generation within the corridor. Other developments, that flattened or at least washed out, by the time you're in the greater or near the greater metropolitan areas. So the trend lines, as we look at real data from 1977 to 2007, in a 30-year period, we get about a 2.8% growth per year on 18, 2.6 on 99W, and about 2.5 on the bridges. If we shift forward 10 years, we're seeing a 3.4% growth, really the magnitude of impact of that casino. 2.8 on 99W and about 2.7 in the Salem bridges. If we look just at the last 10 years, we've dropped all the way down to 1.6%, 1.4 and 1.4 coincidentally. Significantly different growth rates as you start to shorten that historic time horizon. Now as you take out in the last 13 years and remove the impact of the significant crash in 08, we're at a half or 0.8% growth per year. So let's look at what those trends mean. Here's the FHWA forecast taking a 1993 forward to 2013. We would be right on the money in Newburgh. We'd be a little higher if it weren't for the recession in Salem. It'd be quite a bit less because of that single land use impact. And now I'm going to start showing some trend lines of if we looked at 87 to 2007, here's where we would end up in our forecast in each of those locations. If we look at the most recent 20-year period, including the recession, we'd be at a much lower spot in each of those. And then it's difficult to see this blue line, but that's the FHWA forecast at a little over 1.04% average annual growth rate as applied. For Newburgh, it would be, we'd in essence match it. For 18, we're still slightly lower because of the crash, but we're not taking into consideration the significance of all of that brand new casino traffic, and we'd similarly be right on the money in the Salem Street bridges. So if you compare, the pre-recession growth trends and the post-recession growth trends, we're wildly different, where we end up in a forecast of 20-year traffic conditions. And I bring this up just to highlight the sensitivity of making sure you understand what history you're using and what annual growth rates you're applying in your localized transportation planning. So in McMinnville, what does that mean? We need to go back into our travel demand model estimates in McMinnville, look at our Cordon stations, incorporate now a dramatically different average annual growth rate for those locations, and then particularly within interchange areas that have a significant proportion of non-local traffic, go back into some of those focused area plans and make sure that we aren't using overly robust traffic forecast estimates, and get our future forecasts more current to the most recent trends that we're seeing throughout localized regions as well as statewide. And that means getting back to carving out, different trend line estimates, particularly for some of those key facilities. And just as an example, estimates even on the rural sections of those cordon stations, we could still be 20 to 25% off. That might mean the difference in the need for a significant roadway widening when you get to the local level. And those all have dollar signs attached to them, and it's important to bear that in mind. So with that, here are the key things, and then I'd like to be open to a series of questions. Some of the key findings: Oregon is urbanizing, and we're continuing to see the effect of regional and localized travel patterns because of that. How is that coming about? Some of that is marketplace at work. Some of that is statewide policy and growth management. And if you've paid attention to, the research on what was the 3, then became the 5, now the 6 Ds, describing the key characteristics affecting VMT in urbanized areas, density and high-quality transit are key ingredients that are indicators of how people travel and behave in those environments. But certainly the economic and demographic shifts that we've seen are parts of the potentially the marketplace effect. Most local and recent traffic data trends roughly align with FHWA's VMT forecast, but it's not universal. You have to be, cognizant of key localized land use characteristics, and that we need to continue to examine those annual counts and look at the local land use context around them. And then ultimately, revising and updating and replacing our outdated trends as needed. So with that, I'd like to answer any questions that you might have, and I can flip back to slides that you'd like me to reference. Excuse me. And my 401k was not registered to any baseline value. I don't want you to know that I only started out with $1,000, and it wasn't that big of a deal. Kelly.
Great presentation. I don't know if I have so much of a focus question, but just things to sort of think about. And when I was thinking about particularly the McMinnville example and thinking about 99 West, like at some point, without looking at the capacity of the roadway, you're going to level off on your VMT estimates because you can't get there. Of the roadway. And so how much of this discussion nationally has to do with our shift from building capacity to maintaining it, and just that we've kind of reached our limit. And then when we think about VMT per capita, why would we think that would just infinitely expand? That we would,
right.
Yeah.
Big policy issues that are continuing to be debated and emerge, but what are the realistic issues that are, and 99W Newburgh has been, I wrote the first Newburgh TSP back in 1991, and we were drawing out some of the first estimates of what the bypass impact would be. But we were always struggling with, well, no matter what you do on the bypass, that might help Dundee and Newburgh downtown, but you still have to get to I-5 in order to access the rest of the region. And since 91, Sherwood and Tigard and Tualatin have roughly been consuming the surface arterial and highway system capacity. And if anyone tries to go in that corridor, even at 2 in the afternoon, it's a long slog, and who would want to go buy a home, out in Dundee and commute that route anymore? So, Kelly, the real issue is 99W is almost fixed, and unless you're assuming there's going to be some major widening in that corridor and a new connection to I-5 that opens up, access to regional accessibility, it's not very realistic to assume that you're going to always see this rolling growth trend there. And I've had that same scratch the head, wait a minute, I don't see that trend continuing. In fact, if you look at some of the data, you know, the 30th highest hour has plateaued even more severely than the ADT on 99W, which is telling me, wow, there's a bigger effect of congestion in this corridor rather than just, you know, the regional effects of larger economy and home ownership and home income. With that much smaller or a decline in the 30th highest hour, our previous forecasts that we thought were accurate, I think it comes into question. You know, I don't know that you're going to see that latent demand unless there's a realistic capacity enhancement there. So I want to study that more because there's something curious going on there. And I think we see that in other areas when the finite capacity, even if we're looking at daily traffic, there still is some reasonable finite capacity of a facility. We're not going to see peak hour conditions for 18, 20 hours a day. And some of those key routes like 99W that really separates the Portland region with the rest of the Willamette Valley, it's going to be interesting to see how all that plays out. But I would agree with you. I don't think that trend has got the longevity that we once thought it did.
The other thing is the synergy with information communication technology sort of at its point to substitute or at least complement, make our travel more efficient, may have had its impact, but I think that's a much harder thing to gain.
It in some of the national research, I'm sorry, I'm not don't have great dexterity on this. I'm going to have to just quickly roll up. You know, the percentage of workers who aren't necessarily commuting directly each day, that's another factor that's playing into that VMT per capita change. So it's not just the shift with millennial population and the choice of mode. One of those is telecommuting, and it's not necessarily just an age group for that, because I do it, and I used to do it every day, you know, for 10 years. But more and more people will have that latitude and flexibility, and that can play into a local economy pretty significantly. Bend as a case in point. A lot of you know, fairly wealthy semi-retirees are moving to Bend because they can do their business worldwide from Bend, and their VMT may not be driving, you know, the same length as average someone else in a more traditional suburban community, right?
Along those lines, maybe it's dumb, but I mean, in addition to telecommuting, do you consider like possibly just increased job opportunity within like McMinnville? Because when I think of McMinnville, like 2000, 2013, I think wineries, I think more economic activity.
No, and throughout the planning process, we knew that was going on. McMinnville was it's the county seat, so it's a governmental seat, and it was becoming more of the craft wine and now beer industry too. So it's starting to see what Bend is seeing right now, and it's not the bedroom commute community that it once was back in the early 80s. They had a major, it was Hewlett-Packard in the mid to late 80s or early 90s, you know, jumped ship and left and evacuated McMinnville. So it was a local industry with a lot of job destinations for local residents. It's taken a long time to backfill that local industry, but it's seen a resurgence in that stay-at-home. So people who are choosing to live there, while the growth in population has been lower, it's been people who choose to live and work there, not telecommute. And I suspect a bit of that's going on in Newburgh too. But you're absolutely right. That has been a significant change in pattern for McMinnville. Yeah. Yes.
Can you help me understand what you were referencing about the 30th highest hour?
Yeah. Hang on. So in many transportation studies, when you're planning for systems and facilities, you don't use a daily volume to determine, you know, what the infrastructure capacity should be. You tend to want to see, well, what's going on when we have the highest level of congestion, and not necessarily build for that directly, but to be able to accommodate within some range of comfort. So it's the level of comfort on traffic congestion, and that may vary by communities. What regional plans and local policies are based on here in the Portland metro area are not the same as Lincoln City, Oregon. They'll choose a different quality of transportation congestion that they're willing to tolerate, and then want to build a plan to meet. So the 30th highest hour is for every hour throughout 365 day, you sort your data on the highest to lowest hour volume in one and both directions. You go to the 30th highest hour and say, if we can design for that, then we're really good about accommodating travel throughout a typical weekday, weekend, what have you. In most communities, it's roughly the PM peak hour. Now, the PM peak hour will be on average lower than that 30th highest hour, but the historical practice has been if you can build for the 30th highest hour, then you're going to be pretty good throughout the rest of the year and throughout the typical weekday and weekend. That's going to be different in Newburgh and Dundee because you get the rush to the beach on Friday afternoon. The 30th highest hour could be Sunday on a holiday, for a recreation tourism community. So you want to be really careful about that. The reason I put that out there, though, for 99W is there's a lot of travel that's packed up in and around the 30th highest hour because of all of the things that are going on. There's the wine industry, there's the casino, there's the coastal traffic, there's the typical commute in the afternoon, and you get massive shifts in traffic over and through that corridor to access all of those destinations. I wanted to see where the 30th highest hour, whether it was continuing to grow just like average daily traffic in the corridor, and if not, is that an indicator that we're capping out, in terms of the real functioning capacity of that corridor. So when I see that pink line below the average daily traffic line, that tells me, and it's declining, it means that volume may still be, the 30th highest hour volume may be the same number for the last 10 years. It's just not continuing to grow. And so that tells me we're in compression. Something's affecting, latent demand. Things aren't continuing to grow together. There may be more activity in that area, but during one heavily congested hour, just not able to get that much more traffic through there, if that makes sense to you. Are you taking traffic engineering coursework, or are you in planning? If you'll know that a lot more in traffic engineering coursework, because it's one of the historical measures that we've used historically to gauge system performance and capacity. Scott.
So I've got two questions, and I'm sitting right next to ODOT, so maybe I can ask you, John, this. But if I understood your slide correctly about 2005 being basically ODOT's last official growth forecast, VMT forecast for the associated with the transportation plan.
I'd like, if that's the, Scott, it's not necessarily the last official, it's just what was estimated back in 2005 before the recession. No one knew the recession was going to crash when it did.
Has ODOT come up with an updated official VMT forecast? VMT and VMT per capita, I guess.
Hold on. I haven't had a chance to find out. I want to bring that slide up here real quick. Sorry.
I can answer that question one way, which is that we still make a choice on a project-by-project basis about what the growth rate will be. So you're still, I'm working on the Rose Quarter, you're working on 205, someone's working on Sunset. Okay, we'll work with our team and say, okay, we think this is going to be the growth rate here. So
within the context of the project area.
Yeah, there are other values where TPOW has said, this is it. This is value of time. This is the official ODOT value of time updated to 2013. There is no official growth rate that I use to project that future VMT when I'm working on this project or that project. We're doing it on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah. And it makes sense because things can change dramatically even within an urban area. There can be such great variation.
My second question is sort of out of the context of your presentation, but recognizing that Uber and Lyft are, now in Oregon, a little bit delayed from other parts of the country, particularly in this region. I'm wondering if you or maybe anyone is familiar with what the implications of those types of services, that phenomenon on VMT per capita. Is it just is it simply shifting from either driving your personal vehicle or maybe taking transit and not much, or I know that it's likely going to have or is having implications on parking demand and a way of reducing that. But I'm curious about that.
I think maybe I might stack on to that. What about automated vehicle impacts? What is that going to mean if it becomes a significant reality? And I was thinking of this even in ODOT's thought about congestion pricing. What would happen theoretically if we had a 10% increase in automated vehicle fleet operations and independent users had their car take them into work and then send it back home to park because they didn't want to pay for parking in a highly priced community? That would dramatically increase for that travel behavior VMT per capita. So instead of a VMT per capita reduction trend, what does it mean for that? I don't have the answer. It's like, but just as you were mentioning earlier, we're going to have to start thinking about what are the implications of those technologies and whether they're going to increase VMT and VMT per capita or whether they're going to be part of the reduction. And then it's also the type of vehicle. VMT per capita, is often looked at because it can be a close proximate measure of greenhouse gas production. And a lot of state and local policies are being developed to tackle and achieve VMT per capita reduction so that you could perhaps, or more likely, see a reduction in greenhouse gases by the light utility private vehicle. So all of that is, I don't have the answer to it, but there's lots of factors involved with that, and it's requiring further study. I have, some of that, if you've not seen it, Driving in the Built Environment does do a really good job nationally of documenting the relationship between economic development, motorized travel demand, energy use, and greenhouse gas production. So I think that's a good resource to begin with, but even it is now becoming outdated because it was published in, I think, 2009. So there's been a lot of research since then. Then it was 5 Ds, now it's 6 Ds, design, density, a whole bunch of other Ds reflecting the built environment. But it's a topic for a much longer conversation that I can't cover today. Any other questions?
I'll sneak one more in. In the context of a TSP, what stakeholders are excited about a different VMT forecast, a lowering of a VMT forecast, and what stakeholders are reluctant to acknowledge a lower VMT forecast?
In our committees, this is typically what you hear. Home builders and economic development industry leaders want to see system expansion so that vehicle performance is most efficient and transportation plans are funded so that they can get goods and people to and from places efficiently. So when they see VMT per capita reduction, they get worried. What does that mean? Are we not investing in the transportation system? Are we having to, account for different economic factors on that? Those that I think see positive things on that are environmental interests, walk, bike, transit supporters. And it all comes down to, in the planning process, where is a community investing its really constrained funding sources to pay for transportation enhancements? Is it capital expansion for commuters? Is it bike ped system connectivity? Is it transit access and transit system expansion? Healthy communities get a good blend and get everyone on as best as possible the same page. But that's, John, where you see, where I hear, you know, not necessarily a point of conflict, but that's where the debate occurs. Truckers want to see, you know, congestion-free routes. It's a natural. They don't want to be pushed beyond, you know, a typical workday because that forces them into more expensive operations. And the longer their trucks are waiting in a congestion queue, the more money they're spending on non-delivery. So that's, you know, that's a typical thing that we hear from industry quite a bit. And then, you know, homeowners, people want to get, half of them are drivers, so they want to get to their job as quick as possible and as pain-free as possible. Others are willing to choose different routes, different locations, walk or bike, particularly in metro areas like Portland, use transit. So they're wanting to see, you know, a balanced investment across the modes. But that's where these things come into play, and they can, in one small city, can mean it can make or break, you know, whether you're really coming at them with good data or not. So that's the importance of getting this right, is to make sure that all of those interests are looking at the same data and at least agreeing on the forecast, and then can begin the debate on where to spend their money. But if they think that you're just stacking the deck with 3 and 4% average annual growth rate in vehicular traffic, people are smart now. They're going, no way is that going to happen in my town. Or if it's 0.4%, you know, the rest of the population is going to go, we're not growing at all. That doesn't seem reasonable either. So getting at that sweet spot that's, you know, based on good data is really the first thing that you need to get right in your planning. Otherwise, that debate can go askew in a hurry. Thank you. If you want a copy of some of the sources that I've got in this, please send me an email. I think in my bio I've got an email there, so please email me or give me your email if you want copies of some of these sources.